Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hi, welcome again to our discussion of contemporary world poetry. If you can quickly recall, in the last class we were discussing the poetry of Hafiz and how that has left a kind of a rich legacy, on world poetry. We discussed how Hafiz's poetry celebrates a kind of a union between the soul and the higher entity, and how in order for us to live together there is a need for us to hold each other's hands and climb the ladder, because it is an existential journey and there is no other option but for us to hold each other's hand and walk together. Before that, of course, we were discussing the concept of world literature and contemporary world literature, and immediately after a discussion of contemporary world literature, we began with a discussion of Hafiz's poetry, and we also identified Hafiz as a 13th century Persian poet. So, naturally a question can come, well, you talked about contemporary poetry, contemporary world literature, then why are you discussing, or why have you begun a discussion of contemporary world poetry with a poet who lived many centuries ago, right? Well, before we answer that, we need to understand that the concept, the word contemporary has two meanings. One, of course, one meaning is that it is rooted in time, in a temporal world. That means somebody who shares the space with us right now in this time scale is contemporary. Somebody who is living with me in this period is my contemporary. That is one meaning. But more than that, contemporary is also somebody who is still relevant to us even to this day. In that sense, Vyasa, how many centuries ago he wrote, he is still relevant to us. Valmiki, still relevant to us. Shakespeare, still relevant to us. Therefore, you can't call them poets of antiquity. No, they are always contemporary poets. That is the reason why I began with a discussion of Hafiz, because his poetry is contemporary, not just today, not just yesterday, even in the days to come it remains contemporary and relevant. That is the reason why, of course, we began our discussion with the poetry of Hafiz. All right. In this class, we are going to take up our voyage of poetry with European poetry. In fact, I am sure you must have had some interesting dates so far, right. So, today probably we can take you on a date with European poetry. Of course, the area itself is quite vast. We are covering an entire continent. Obviously, we will not be able to do justice to very many significant poets that fall under European poets category. So, like we have been following, we pick up some important poets or select poets and select poetry, and through them, of course, we are going to understand European poetry. Okay. Let us begin with our first poet of Europe. He is none other than the Romanian poet Vasco Popa. The moment you say the name Vasco Popa, the name itself reeks of some extraordinary poetry. It seems the Romanian name itself has some kind of brilliant poetry in it. Well, not many of us may have heard of this name. There is a reason behind that, because deliberately, as we have already discussed in one of our earlier classes, we are going to bring to the fore some of those poets who are extraordinary, but for unfortunate reasons related to canon, colonization and hegemony of the West, have remained at the periphery. In fact, if you and I have not heard of Vasco Popa, like to the extent you and I have heard of W.B. Yeats or Mariana Moore or T.S. Eliot, that's not because Vasco Popa is not as great as them. That's because he did not write in English, and also he was not born in England, he was not born in the United States of America, he was not born in the prominent West. But as students of literature, we know that that does not diminish the value of their poetry. If we don't come to know of their poetry, the loss is not to them but to us. Therefore, keeping that subaltern spirit in mind, we wish to bring and present before all of you those great voices that are not as popular as other great poets, other British and American poets. That is the reason why we are bringing to you all these extraordinary poets, Vasco Popa. Okay. So, generally speaking, Vasco Popa's poetry, it is said that it is seeped in folk wisdom. He is also a major 20th century poet that you can see 1922 and 1991. So, his poetry, this is what a fellow British poet, Ted Hughes, who is equally great poet, says about Vasco Popa. His poetry grows a rose garden in the barren lands of war. Of course, if we look at the history of Serbia, which was earlier Yugoslavia, we see that the entire land had a lot of political unrest and turmoil. Therefore, like all progressive voices, Vasco Popa too was a subject of persecution. What is remarkable is, though he himself is a victim of war, of course, Vasco Popa was, he directly participated in the World War, okay, and he was also captured in the World War and incarcerated in a German concentration camp. Fortunately, he survived all the physical torture, mental trauma, and lived to tell the tale of his torture through his beautiful poetry. His first major collection of poems, Kora, comes out in 1953, and of course, he also played a major role in grooming voices of other young poets, because he went on to edit a publishing house, Nolet, from 54 to 79 for quite a long time. Some of his important works include, of course, let me read their English translations for you. No Rest Field, published in 56, Secondary Heaven, published in 1968, Earth Erect in 72, Wolf Salt in 75, Apple of Gold in 1978, and of course, later Ted Hughes also plays a major role in bringing his collected poetic works in English. Annie Pennington and others have also brought out collected works of Vasco Popa in English. So, when Ted Hughes, an extraordinary poet himself, was exposed to the voice of Vasco Popa, he had something extraordinary to say. Being a fellow poet, of course, it was very nice of him to have acknowledged the greatness of Popa, and he later also says, Vasco Popa is known for different cycle of poems, So, based on that, Ted Hughes also creates his own cycle of poems, the Crow cycle of poems, and he acknowledges the influence of Vasco Popa on his own poetry. And he says, Vasco Popa's poetry is filled with a strangeness of imagery with familiar, down-to-earth observations. So, what is extraordinary is not the imagery, but the way he presents it. Always this is something that we need to know, this is a little secret that poets have for themselves. Their images, their metaphors, are not something extraordinary. Every poet picks up her own metaphors from the life she has lived around, from the life that she has lived. Therefore, these metaphors are not extraordinary, but what they acquire an extraordinary potential by the way the poet uses them, or in the way the poet uses them. That is precisely what Ted Hughes acknowledges here. And he goes on to say that as Popa penetrates deeper into life with book after book, it begins to appear like a universe is passing through another universe. When you read his poetry, Ted Hughes feels, and all sensible readers feel, that as if an entire universe is passing before us, or a universe of poetry is passing through the universe of reality. What an extraordinary feeling, right? An interdimensional experience, a universe passing through our universe. Brilliant lines, So here comes a brilliant poem. This is time for us, of course, to dip ourselves into the lake of Popa's poetry, The Little Box. Now take a look at this beautiful poem. Of course, there are a couple of translations of this poem. This is just one version. In another version, it's called The Small Box. So in this version, it's called The Little Box. The little box grows her first teeth, and her little length grows, her little width, her little emptiness, and everything she has. Now, of course, we have already discussed various poetic devices, right? You can identify little box growing its own teeth, and the poet calls the little box her and teeth. Obviously, you can identify personification here. And of course, the little box itself is, it's an extraordinary symbol. More than a symbol, it becomes a metaphor. Later, you know that, because he does not compare little box to anything, right? So it's not a simile, but it becomes a metaphor. So one of the key things to understand poetry is, please don't chase meaning right in the very first line, right in the very first stanza. Don't try to look for meaning in a poem. That's when we lose the soul of a poem, or we lose the spirit of poetry. In order to appreciate poetry, just read it. Forget the meaning. Forget the reading when you read it for the first time. Forget the meaning when you read it for the second time. If you don't get it on your own, don't search, don't struggle, and don't fret. Just read the poem. As I said, it's like when you read a poem acquires its complete potential in the world of the sound that you create. In other words, you think of the spirit of a poem as something that resides like Aladdin's magic lamp. You know that Aladdin's magic lamp, right? There is a huge genie that's stuck within the magic lamp. So you can't even imagine, until the genie comes out, you can't imagine that there is a huge genie residing in that magic lamp. So what brings the genie alive is your magical touch. Similarly, when you read a poem, the magical touch of your voice brings the genie out, and that's when you realize how huge the genie is. So don't try to, forget the meaning, focus on reading it as slowly and as meaningfully as possible, as with all the pauses. The little box grows her first teeth. So you know that this little box may connote a small girl or a small boy. Think of it as a small girl. Forget the box part. There are various ways through which a poet can connect box with a girl. So maybe he is talking about a little girl. Let's go with maybe, and later the meaning becomes clear after some time. Let's go with vagueness, because the journey of a poem begins on a note of vagueness, and by the time it by the time it crystallizes, it takes some time. Please remember that's applicable for all the poems that we have read. Okay, the little box grows her first teeth, and her little length grows, her little width, her little emptiness, and everything she has. Everything grows. Look at the tenderness the poem assumes by its intelligent use of words such as little, teeny teeth, first teeth, little emptiness, and all that. So obviously anything that's born has to grow. The little box grows and grows, and now inside her is the cupboard she was in before. Earlier this little box was a part of the cupboard. Now she has grown so much that the cupboard is now inside her. And the growth doesn't stop. She grows and grows and grows, and now inside her is the room and the house and the town and the land and the world she was in before. Now look at it. Now look at this beautiful picture, the visual picture. Imagine a small world, and within that small world is another small world, within that is another. How the entire world is inverted in the small box. How the entire world is inverted in the small box. So probably the poem is talking about the process of growing and acquiring wisdom. Metaphorically, the poem is all about the process of growing up with grace, growing up gracefully and acquiring wisdom, and probably knowledge or wisdom, more than knowledge, probably we can call it wisdom, experience, how it goes on expanding from being a cell to from being an atom, then a little bigger than that, then a little bigger than that, then a little bigger than that, such that now it has acquired an entire dimension of the world. Now there is a transition here. In the fourth stanza, the little box remembers her childhood and by wishing really hard becomes a little box again. Now probably something happens and now comes the intervention of memory, and now what happens? Willfully the little box wants to become young again, small again, so it becomes small again. Now inside that little box is the whole world, all teeny weeny, easy to slip in your pocket, easy to steal, easy to lose. Look after the little box. That's the reason it becomes easy to lose that. Anybody may steal it, therefore that's the reason why we need to look after it in a very careful way. Now look at it without actually saying something, how this poem says so much. When it begins, you don't know what the poem is talking of, but by the time you complete reading it, maybe once or twice, you will have intuitively grasped something. That's the reason why it says that much before we consciously realize the meaning of the poem will have already sown the seed of what it has got to say within us. That's how, rather than the meaning, the seed has been sown in us, and it takes, depending on how we take care of it, it takes some time for the seed to grow and become a full-fledged tree. From here, let's go on to another beautiful poem. We raise our arms, the street climbs into the sky, right? Of course, when we raise our hand, the entire street appears as if it's climbing to the sky through you. We lower our eyes. When you lower our eyes, the roofs go down into the earth. It's about perspective, right? The poet is talking about the perspective. Now look at it. When I close my eyes or when I blink, I seem to eclipse the sun. Of course, you must have heard of this conceit when we were discussing metaphysical poetry, right? John Donne's beautiful poem, Sun Rising. When you close your eyes or when you blink an eye, you eclipse the sun. It's about perspective. Similarly, when you raise your hand, you make an entire street go up into the sky. When you lower your eyes, you make the rooftop, sink into the ground. From every pain we do not mention grows a chestnut tree that stays mysterious behind us. When you have some pain, if you don't share it, if you don't mention it, it grows to assume the proportion of a huge chestnut tree, and that always stays behind us, a huge burden. So therefore, you need to say that, right? That's precisely what the poem is talking of. From every hope we cherish sprouts a star that moves unreachable before us. Now here is hope. So if you don't share pain, it becomes huge and you can sink along with it. And with every ray of hope, a new star sprouts out of you and reaches and takes you to the sky. And now here, can you hear a bullet flying about our heads? Can you hear a bullet waiting to ambush our kiss? Why is the poet all of a sudden talking of a bullet flying overhead? So beautifully he is talking of, lovely things. Why is the poet all of a sudden talking of, bullets flying over our heads and, maybe, bombs falling somewhere in a distance? Why is that? Of course, there is a reason behind this, and this is precisely why poetry of Popa becomes important to us, because Popa leads, he was a part of avant-garde poetic movement in the 1950s, so his poetry is influenced by French surrealism, more than that Serbian folk tales. So, it is a kind of a cocktail, a beautiful aesthetic cocktail of Serbian folk tales and French surrealism. But of course, while being surrealistic, it does not share the inefficacy of poetry that generally comes along with surrealism. So, it takes the best of surrealism, it takes the best of folk world and combines it. Now comes the question, why is his poetry talking of, when he is talking of beautiful things, all of a sudden why do you hear the gun sounds? It is not just in that poem, you keep, that is a constant feature, because remember, he wrote in the background, he wrote during the times when there was war, there was political unrest, there was social turmoil in his own land, there was in the name of socialist reformation, there was oppression in the East European part. Of course, he himself was a part of the Great World War. So, the society was under the great turmoil. So, he himself was a victim of that. Imagine what a poet will have gone through when he was incarcerated in a Nazi concentration camp. I do not need to explain to you what happened in the concentration camp, how inhumanly they were treated. Nevertheless, his poetry talks of hope, because if there is no ray of hope, you can't survive that kind of oppression. That is the reason why, even in the backdrop of guns blazing, bombs dropping, you talk of building, hopes, and that happens when you try to focus on it. That is why the poet talks of perspective. If you can ignore to listen to what is happening behind you, the unpleasant things, then there is a ray of hope for you. That is the reason why you can say that his poetry quenches the war-wrecked generations of the erstwhile Yugoslavia with rich, imaginative verses that have the capacity to offer fresh heartbeats, not just to his poetry, but to an entire society, And that is the reason why Ted Hughes compares Vasco Popa rightly to other two great East European poets, Zbigniew Herbert of Poland and Miroslav Holub of Czech Republic. They are exemplary poets, extraordinary poets, That is the reason why you also have Ted Hughes remarking in his introduction to the collected poems of Vasco Popa that his poetry is marked by a profound sense of an understanding. What is that understanding? That in the face of war, where people actually die of bullets and bombs, poetry, like most of the art, is not equipped for life, right? Now, of course, it only happens in the Mahabharata that, between, when the two armies are ready, a beautiful poetry emerges, Bhagavad Gita, that is again metaphoric, right? And similarly like that, when in the backdrop of war, Vasco Popa's poetry emerges, that is an alternative to war, that is an alternative to war. So, we cannot, if we do not, in order to fully understand the beauty of Bhagavad Gita, we need to know the context in which it is there. On the one hand, there is war, and on the other hand, there is a beautiful, poetic piece that offers ray of hope and an alternative perspective to war, violence and other things. So, his poetry is something like that. So, it is aware that in the face of bullets, poetry cannot do anything. Nevertheless, you cannot give up hope. That is the reason why their poetry begins from the point of despair, loss and grief, and revolves engagingly around struggling, suffering, but when it ends, it does not end on a pessimistic note, it ends on an unyielding human spirit that springs to life even when that is thrown on dry rock and cold earth. That is the reason, it is an extraordinary celebration of hope in the face of adversity that we talk of. That is something that we have to keep in mind, So, that is the reason why, his poetry sings songs of hope, love and compassion, and that is the reason why, there is a need. His poetry believes that there is a need to offer an alternative precept of life to the hardwired and brutish human mind, right? Wars are a reality, terrorism is a reality, and violence is a reality. In the face of all that, there is a need to nurture our soul from a different way. We can't find the succor, the necessary succor for our soul from the war, terrorism, violence, hatred that is unleashing all around us. So, we need to find the succor of our life through the poetry. That is the reason why we said that there is his poetry takes up the task of growing a beautiful rose garden in the barren soil bed of warmongering political mind. That is his poem for us, and that is the reason why many of his poems replace war games with beautiful love games, compassion, and his poetry offers oases of love for all the violence that it has witnessed. So, that is the reason why we need to go back to Vasco Popa. I am sure you have liked his poem. Before we move on to another poet, if you are really intrigued by his poetry, drawn to the vortex of his poetry, then here are some memorable poems that you can look up and read, available on the internet. It is available in English translation, especially games, a forgetful number, between games. Look up for all these poems. All right. Yeah. Now, let us move on to another important poet, Anna Akhmatova. She is Russia's most beloved poets of all time. Like Vasco Popa, Anna Akhmatova's poetry too is marked by the presence of oppressive regimes. Her poetry blooms in the backdrop of violence and oppression and victimhood that she herself personally feels, like Vasco Popa. That is also one of the reasons why we are unearthing all these poets, how in the face of darkness and despair their poetry sings of light, right. Now, imagine her poetry, much of her poetry today has survived not because there was a copy of her poetry available. Imagine a poet having to write down her poems for their best friend, to learn them by rote, to learn them by heart, and later burning them up so that there is no evidence of transmission found, because she was writing against the totalitarian regimes. She was writing against oppressive regimes. She was writing against a system of governance that was trying to curtail human liberty, that was trying to curb on human spirit. That is the reason why there was always a constant surveillance on her. So, she had to write in a very stealth mode, and that is why fortunately she had a few friends, and she committed all her poems to them, and they memorized parts of her poetry, and later when there were the turbulent times were over, they wrote it down. That is how Anna Akhmatova's poetry survived, thanks to her friends, thanks to the extraordinary memory. Today we have her remarkable poems. Now, brief background to her life. Anna Akhmatova was of course rightfully compared with the four major Russian poets of 20th century, Mandelstam, Tsveteva, and Boris Pasternak. Of course, you may have heard of Boris Pasternak, but Anna Akhmatova is equally important, in a sense a little more important than them, you can call it. She published her first collection while she was very young, and later of course she acquired her pen name Akhmatova. It has a lasting impact. Her poetry has a lasting impact on humanity for various reasons. She personally led a very tragic life. There were a lot of turmoils, there were a lot of ebbs and flows in her own life, series of political turmoils. There was a First World War, her divorce, October Revolution, the fall of Tsardom. She led a very tragic life, and unfortunately her first husband Gumilev, who also played a major role in floating major revolutionary, counter revolutionary movement, he was executed. Her own son was imprisoned and incarcerated for a long time. So in the face of all these hardships, her poetry bloomed, and her own life was under constant surveillance, So, all these things played a major role. Now, this is Requiem. She is well known for this beautiful poem, Requiem. I spent 17 months waiting in line outside the prison in Leningrad. It's autobiographical. The poem is completely autobiographical. One day somebody in the crowd identified me. Standing behind me was a woman with lips blue from the cold, who had of course never heard me called by name before. Now she started out of the torpor common to us all and asked me in a whisper. Everyone whispered there, "Can you describe this?" And I said, "I can." Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what had once been her face. Look how beautifully, just silence, silenced whispers talk of how there is, the poet does not overtly say there is a curb on freedom of expression, freedom of speech and all that. The silence symbolizes, the silence in a manner of synecdoche talks of the entire regime of, totalitarian regime that banned free speech and free expression and all that from her Requiem. Yeah, she was a part of a group of poetry called Acmeus, founded by her own first husband Gumilev, and unfortunately later he was executed for that. Her first collection of poetry, Vecher, in Russian Evening, was very well received, followed by her second one, Rosary, which also gained her a lot of critical acclaim. But after these two contributions, there was a long period of lull. It's not that she wasn't writing, but she was not supposed to write and publish. The world was not supposed to know that she was writing, therefore probably she was secretly engaged in writing her poetry. So, she is today well known for two of her poems, Requiem, a part of which we read earlier, and Poem Without a Hero, Poem Without a Hero. And Requiem was dedicated, as I said, when she was, every day she was visiting Leningrad prison in order to find out the fate of her son, who was dragged away midnight, when he was sleeping. So, this poem is dedicated to everybody who shared that fate, because it was not just the poet, there was an entire chunk of people who faced similar fate, So, the poem is dedicated to everyone who saw and shared the fate of their loved ones being dragged away in the middle of the night to be crushed by acts of torture and repression. That was the time they were living in. And of course, later it took her almost 20 years to complete her poem, Poem Without a Hero, and the two poems appeared posthumously. So, yeah, let us quickly take a look at her poem and then we can finish this class. I drink to our ruined house, to the evil of my life, to our loneliness together, and I drink to you, to the lying lips that have betrayed us, to the dead cold eyes, to the fact that the world is brutal and coarse, to the fact that God did not save us. That is the reason why probably, you have Dostoevsky said that we are living and writing in a world where anything can be, you can live in any way and you can write in any way, because we are living in a world where God is dead. That is his sentiment. Of course, many shared that sentiment. That was in the name of a beautiful ideology, an egalitarian ideology, how regimes can be totalitarian. Even under an egalitarian ideology, a regime can be totalitarian. That is what can be more farcical than that, right. So, that is the reason why it says the last toast. And of course, dead cold eyes, the world is brutal, talks of surveillance era where you are watched for everything you do and things like that. This is her poetry. And look at this again, another beautiful poem, The Return. So, there are other extraordinary poems like that. So, if you are interested, you can take a look at her poetry as well. So, this is Vasco Popa and Anna Akhmatova, products of or victims of great violence, nevertheless never succumbed to that violence and wrote with hope, and today their poetry offers a beacon of hope for all citizens who are victims of violence and suppression. All right. So, in the next class, let us continue our discussion of some more European poets and their poetry. Until then, take care. Thank you.